But I now see, and I'm just going to give him a moment to settle. Professor Robert Patman is sitting in his study looking very academic. And we haven't talked to Robert for a while, but the world rolls on around us. So I thought it would be a good time to catch up and have a talk about what is going on here and in particular in Ukraine. Robert, lovely to have you with us again. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Sean. It's a pleasure to be with you.
You're coming through loud and clear. Well, as I think I predicted to you some time ago, the war in Ukraine, in terms of its publicity around it and public interest, would go through an arc that would peak, and if it kept on going, it would sort of not quite be the big hot story it was. But it still goes on, and we're heading, into summer? You can then the mud starts to dry up. What is the military situation on the ground in Ukraine at the moment from what you can perceive?
I think that the counter-offensive is well and truly underway now. I think the preliminary work has been done by the Ukrainians. What is the preliminary work? There's been targeting Russian ammunition dumps and supply lines in Russian-occupied Ukraine. There's also been sort of softening activities such as incursions in Russia itself, Belgorod, the border city with Ukraine. And this softening up process, which has been going on for some time, now seems to have gathered momentum with quite intense targeting of Russian lines, particularly around Zaporizhia. And we have also seen, and the news has been dominated, I'm sure our listeners and viewers are aware of this, the mining or the explosion of the dam at Kokova. So there's quite a lot happening. Of course, both Russia and Ukraine are blaming each other for this, what looks like an environmental disaster of a huge magnitude. And that will play out. But I think it will slow the counteroffensive for a while in that particular region. I don't think it will buy the Russians a bit of breathing space, I think, in the region of Kokova, but I don't think it's going to stop the overall momentum along. What we should explain here, Sean, is that the line separating Russian-occupied Ukraine from Ukraine itself is about 1,000 kilometers in length. So, the Russians may complicate or frustrate the Ukrainians in Ukraine in one area, but that doesn't prevent them
busting out another.
Ukrainians from,
Robert, off the battlefield, have there been any major diplomatic developments? What is the position or the security of Putin as Il Supremo in Russia? Have any other countries or the European Union made moves that change things diplomatically behind the scenes, off the battlefield?
No, I don't think so. I think the liberal hawks have won over what I call the realist doves within those groups that support Ukraine. There's always been, as we've discussed before, there's always been a division of opinion amongst those states that oppose Putin's invasion. Some believe or have believed at the beginning of the war, the best way of bringing the war to a speedy conclusion was some sort of land for peace deal. I think that camp has lost out to those who are saying that Putin shows no sign of compromise. Besides, will he honour any land for peace deal? Will it not just be a prelude to further land grabs by the Putin regime? And besides, this is such a flagrant violation of international law. It basically assaults the basic principles that most states operate under, which is respect for state sovereignty and also territorial integrity. By the way, China takes those principles very seriously, and that's the basis of its claim to Taiwan and Hong Kong. The violations by Russia are so profound that there's little scope for compromise, and that camp seems to have won out. That, basically both the United States and the NATO leadership have said they will continue to support Ukraine to the point where Ukraine has effectively ejected the invaders from their country. You asked about Putin's position. I think there are some worrying signs for Putin. We've seen the leader of the Wagner group, this private mercenary group associated with Putin, mock Putin, call him a happy grandfather. This is Prigozhin, the leader, mocking Putin, also particularly mocking, and just the last 24 hours, a sort of expletive, deletive denunciation of some of Putin's key officials, particularly the defense minister, Shoigu. He also said quite darkly that some of these officials are about 2 months away from from being shot. So there is considerable tensions within the Russian camp, and there are also signs, I think, that it's not just Prigozhin who's disillusioned with Putin's leadership. There are other signs, people like Igor Girkin, who was instrumental and something of a nationalist hero in Russia during the annexation of Crimea. He modestly claimed a major role in that event, but what is clear is that there is a number of critics emerging, many of whom are on the nationalist spectrum of Russian politics, who are very critical of Putin. And the costs of this war are taking a cumulative toll, even for an authoritarian regime which jealously guards the flow of information and, quite frankly, doesn't really worry about the gap between what it says and what it does.
Yeah. Robert, that's such a great brief on what's going on. I feel better informed and up to date now. Let's shift focus now to our part of the world, to the Pacific, the South Pacific. We have a United States Assistant Secretary of State in town today, I think, and a lot of discussion around the Pacific Forum and in the Pacific about what the importance of this region is in the superpower struggle between China and the United States. The United States saying we don't want another Cold War with China. Is anything alarming happening here, or is everyone just staking out their spheres of influence?
As mixed signals, I think the rivalry between the United States and China has intensified, but there are indications of back-channel discussions between the US and China. China seems to have backed away a little from Putin. There's never been any evidence that the Chinese have given substantive military assistance to the Putin regime. But I think there were some warnings about a month ago when US intelligence released reports that China was on the brink of arming Putin. The EU called in Xi Jinping's key foreign policy advisor, and the Americans did the same, and both warned the Chinese if they did take this step, they would face pretty comprehensive sanctions. That's very bad news for China, it would be very serious for China, because despite the Belt and Road Initiative, China's economy remains, in export terms, remains critically dependent on the United States and the EU, as well as Japan. So I think this was a reminder by the EU and the US to the Chinese leadership. If you want to avoid political problems at home associated with a slowdown in your economic growth, then you better keep out of the conflict in Russia. The message, I think, has been received and acted on. The Chinese have, they've had the peace plan, but that, of course, basically freezes the status quo in which Russia, there's no attempt in the peace plan for Russia to leave the territory it currently has annexed in Ukraine. So it's mixed signals, I think, Sean. There's no doubt about it. The Americans take a pretty hard-line view. I think one thing that seems to unite the Democrats and the Republicans is concern that, in the words of Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, that China is a systemic threat to the United States position globally. I think there's much more skepticism elsewhere. China's...
Gosh, that almost sounds a bit domino theory, to be honest. Robert, that's slightly concerning, that sort of rhetoric.
Well, yes, but I think it seriously hypes up the Chinese threat. We shouldn't be complacent. I think China's got real global ambitions to displace the United States, but I think the Chinese have a long time frame for that. And secondly, there's no getting round some of the vulnerabilities of China. We've already mentioned one. It's a full-blooded participant in the world capitalist economy, and it's an irony that the communist leadership of China is very dependent on the system they claim they want to overthrow. But secondly, China has got very little what some political scientists call soft power. No one is breaking down doors to copy the Chinese political system. Lots of countries like New Zealand very happy to do business with China, but they do not want a bar of the ideas of what the China stands for in terms of organizing society. So I think China's got a real problem. Like it or dislike it, many people see the United States in terms of the political system a much more attractive proposition.
Yeah.
There's no shortage of people wishing to emigrate to the United States every year. They take in 1 million legal migrants every year. So China, I think, struggles in terms of...
I'll tell you what, that is such an interesting comparison. I wonder how many people flee to China a year.
Not too many. And the friends they've got... And the friends they've got, which are quite substantial in the developing world, are largely because of the fact that China has invested enormously through the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
And you know, from the point of view of developing countries, US, and I include, when we talk about developing countries, we shouldn't also forget about the role of the Pacific Island states.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
These countries, in many respects, the development or the intensification of US-China rivalry is not a bad thing because it gives them more leverage. In other words, they've got more options, they can play one against the other, and they can get more technical and economic assistance.
Yeah, and things are relatively stable here. It would seem to me that places like the Solomons and that have recognised for the moment that America is the preferred option. Things are shoring up slightly.
I think there's a lot of opportunism going here. I'm not trying to disparage the Pacific Island states. New Zealand does the same thing. We're not above taking advantage of the fact there's more than one superpower in the world.
Yeah.
Let's be quite clear on that.
Yeah.
And we did it spectacularly in 2008 when we became the first developed state to sign a free trade agreement with China. I get the sense that if you look at the Solomons, when there was the former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern denounced the Solomons security agreement with the Chinese, the Prime Minister of the Solomons said, well, we already have a similar agreement with Australia, and we don't rule out other agreements either with other countries.
Yeah.
And the PNG, there was a lot of speculation recently about the American agreement with the PNG. The PNG Prime Minister said an almost identical statement. He said, oh, yes, we've got a really wide-ranging agreement with the United States, but it doesn't rule out other agreements with other interested parties.
Nice play. Yeah.
I think we just got to have a sense of proportion. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. And I'll be honest, foreign affairs doesn't seem, for the upcoming election here, doesn't seem to be shaping up as a major issue whatsoever. Hey, thank you so much. It's been too long, literally, Robert. Good to see you well and as across everything and able to explain it as you ever have been. Thank you very much indeed. Professor Robert Patman, give us an update on the Ukraine and also, I guess, our part of the world. Boy, it really has. It's not the big story it was, the Ukraine, is it? And look, here's an interesting text. And I just think it's interesting because it's about something that's happening in social media. Sean, for a different perspective on Ukraine, listeners should have a look at Tucker Carlson on Twitter, should we? Hard to know what the truth is. Yes, it is. So you should source your information from a wide variety of outlets. Great interview with Robert. Cheers, Stephen from Nelson. You're more than welcome, Stephen from Nelson, about that.